All right, so welcome to Lecture 5 of Bio 158, Life Science, a Human Approach. Today, we're going to be talking about respiration and breathing. And so first things first, let's start out with a question for you. Are breathing and respiration the same thing? Let's think about that for a second. Now, generally, when someone says breathing and respirations, our mind kind of go to the specific action of taking a breath. However, depending on what we're talking about, if we're talking about a specific biological process that's called cellular respiration, these two are very different from each other. Now, breathing is exactly what we think. It is what the lungs do to bring in oxygen to the body and get rid of carbon dioxide. Importantly, cellular respiration happens at the cellular level. It is a reaction in the cells that requires oxygen. It's why we actually need a constant supply of it, so we need to constantly keep breathing. We learned during the circulatory system lecture that a specific type of cell were responsible for carrying oxygen, and they deliver oxygen to all the cells of our body. Do you remember what type of cell that was? Yes, if you're thinking red blood cells, those are exactly the types of cells that carry oxygen to all the other cells of our body. The red blood cells are transported by our blood, which is pumped by the heart. Cells are able to use this oxygen along with a simple sugar called glucose, and you might recognize the name glucose from the main sugar that carbs are broken down into from our digestive system lecture, to produce energy for our body. Now we see here the equation for cellular respiration. Now don't worry, I won't have you memorize the anatomical structures of these molecules. I know it's kind of a scary looking equation. But what I do want us to understand about this equation is that glucose and oxygen are the primary inputs into our body that we can see here. So glucose plus oxygen is broken down into carbon dioxide that we usually breathe out, water, and usable energy inside of our cells. So now let's break down the individual portions of the respiratory system. And I do want us to be very I want you guys to study this illustration to the right and diagram very carefully, because I will have you label a few parts of this in our quiz coming up on Wednesday. Now, there are three major parts of the respiratory system. These are, first, the airway, which includes the nose, mouth, pharynx, larynx, trachea, and bronchi, and bronchioles. And we're going to go through each of these individually as we move through the lecture, but just to introduce you to all of them and where they are on the diagram, I wanted to go through it this way. Two are lungs, which I think we're all familiar with, that I'm circling here with the laser pointer. And three, the muscles that are involved in respiration. The only one we can see here is the diaphragm, this thin muscle here that forms the floor of our chest cavity. Other important muscles not shown are intercostal muscles, and we'll get into what those do in the next slide. So first, I'm sure we're all very familiar with what the nose and mouth do. The pharynx, labeled here, another word for the pharynx is the throat, goes from the end of the nasal cavity to the esophagus and larynx. You may have heard the larynx referred to as the voice box. Now the trachea that's labeled here is also called the windpipe, which allows air to pass into the chest cavity here. Once air gets into the chest cavity through the trachea, it splits into left and right branches, into the left and right lungs. These branches are collectively called bronchi, or if you're referring to them individually, the left and right bronchus. The airway then splits into these smaller branches that you can see sort of crisscrossing our lungs here. Now these smaller branches that are branching off the bronchi are called bronchioles. And these conduct air to an even smaller structure in our lungs called the alveoli. And the alveoli aren't pictured here, but we will talk about individually what they do in the coming slides. Again, the lungs, just to round out this slide, a pair of large spongy organs containing many capillaries. And capillaries should sound familiar to you. Do we remember what capillaries are? So if you don't remember what those are, go ahead and revisit some of the circulatory system lectures where we talk about the different types of blood vessels in the circulatory system. So in addition to having many capillaries in these lungs, they also have these tiny cup-like structures that we spoke of earlier called alveoli. We'll learn the primary purpose of the alveoli a bit later in the lecture, but I just wanted to introduce them here. And finally, the third part of our respiratory system are the muscles of respiration. These are the diaphragm, a thin sheet of muscle that we introduced in the previous slide that you can see labeled there. This forms the floor of our chest cavity, and not pictured, but still important, the intercostal muscles. These are muscles that are between your ribs that actually help the diaphragm with expanding and compressing the lungs when you're breathing. Now that we have a good idea of the parts of the respiratory system, let's learn how breathing actually works during the next video.